Hey folks, James Abrenio coming to you from Abrenio Law Podcast. And today I've got a good friend of mine, Brad Henson. I've been trying to get him on here for a while to talk about his immigration practice and kind of how that works. And especially because we do criminal law here, talk about the blend. Brad, I really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you for your time, first of all.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here. Happy to do it.
Yeah. So first of all, just so whoever's watching this knows, tell them a little about your education and background and going to law school and how you ended up in law school.
Sure. So I grew up in Rochester, New York. I went to college there at the University of Rochester. I got interested in law just over the summer during college. I interned at a law office and I liked it.
Mhm.
Didn't have a science major, so ended up going to law school at Washington and Lee,
Mhm.
which is in Virginia. And that led me to the DC area. I initially was interested in criminal law.
Mhm.
It was my favorite class in law school, and was a public defender coming out of law school, opened my own firm, and then slowly transitioned into doing primarily immigration law.
Yeah, and actually, I forgot to mention this off the top, but you recently opened up your own immigration firm, Henson
Mhm.
Immigration, and I'll put the address in the show notes so everybody can access it pretty easily. But just so they know, we actually met I think as you were transitioning out of the public defender's office, and you partnered up with also a good friend of ours, Lysandra Pashuta.
Yes.
Talk about the transition from the PD's office to private practice, and what was that experience like?
Sure. So the public defender's office, this was in Fairfax, Virginia.
Mhm.
Um, the caseload is very high, um, and it's just a very fast-paced practice. So the major transition from that to private practice, one of the reasons that I wanted to do it was just to be able to spend more time on each case,
Mhm.
give each case more of the attention it deserved. I did really like being a public defender, but it was a good transition. I also enjoyed some of the more business kind of operational aspects of having a firm.
Mhm.
Some people really don't like that. I actually really enjoyed that aspect of private practice.
Mhm.
So it was a good transition. I'm happy we did it. Happy I did it.
Yeah, and I used to be a public defender as well. I only lasted like a year, so
I'm in the same
uh,
boat.
yeah, it's a hard job. And one of the and I tell this to everybody calls me and asks questions. And I know public defenders get a bad rap, but the reality is, some of the best trial attorneys that we know, some of the best trial attorneys in Fairfax, Northern Virginia, are public defenders. So what they do is important work, and we are not disparaging them at all. It's
Oh
just
no.
a really really hard job.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
I think it's something where the people who can be in that job for many years and excel at it, it takes a really exceptional trial attorney to do that, I think.
Yeah, and they
So
have, the interesting thing is, they have the most up-to-date knowledge because 'cause they're in the courthouse way more than anybody else.
they are.
So talk about the transition to immigration work. How did that happen, and what sparked your passion in that work?
Yes. So I opened a firm, initially was just doing criminal law.
Mhm.
Over the course of maybe 5 6 years, we had brought another partner into the firm who was doing immigration, and I slowly transitioned into doing immigration over, I would say, the course of that 5 year period.
Mhm.
And I've just really enjoyed it. The thing that I like the most about immigration, as against criminal law, which was what I was used to, was you can do a lot more for clients. At
Mhm.
least that was my experience. Um,
Explain what that means.
mhm. So I found with criminal law, something that was somewhat frustrating about it was someone would come to you in pretty dire straits, usually with something a really serious charge or something that even if it didn't, even if it was a minor charge, would have a really bad effect on their life.
Mhm.
And I would say, you know, 75% of the time, something like that, I found I was mostly trying to mitigate the consequences of that on their life. It was only in a few, maybe 25% of the cases where we would be able to achieve like all the goals that the client would have in mind when they initially came to you.
Mhm.
So something that I would have considered success as a criminal lawyer wouldn't necessarily be what the client would consider as success because it would still have some consequences for them.
Mhm.
With immigration, the main difference I found is that I can almost, 90% of the time achieve what the client's looking for.
Mhm.
Someone comes to you with a problem that they want solved. Some it might be more or less complex, but generally speaking, I find that I can solve that problem.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Now, talk about when we say immigration practice, that is a broad term, I suspect. Tell us specifically when we're talking about your immigration practice, what kind of work are you doing? What kind of folks are you working with?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I've transitioned to primarily handling affirmative cases. So that'd be someone who's petitioning for a relative or family member, so helping someone in a situation like this where they have criminal charges and they're trying to avoid more serious immigration problems as a result of those criminal charges.
Mhm.
I've moved away from doing um, deportation cases, although
Mhm.
that's something I do have quite a bit of experience with.
Mhm.
So my practice now is focused primarily on someone who's making an affirmative application for immigration relief.
So give me like an example of that. Like when would
Mhm.
somebody be affirmatively going to the immigration to?
Sure.
Yeah.
So one situation would be, let's say that you come to the U.S. on a tourist visa,
Mhm.
and something happens in your home country. You believe you're now in danger, and you want to apply for asylum.
Mhm.
So you affirmatively make that application with the government.
Okay.
Uh, or another one might be you come to the US as a student, you meet someone in the US, you start dating, you get married, that your US citizen spouse is now applying for you. So you're making this affirmative application.
Mhm.
Whereas a deportation case would more likely be a situation where you're forced into the problem as a result of getting caught by immigration. And
Ah.
you could be in that situation if you had a green card or some other non-immigrant status, or if you just crossed the border and we're just in the U.S. without any status, and then you come to the attention of immigration.
So I guess either immigration arrest or like law enforcement arrest.
Usually, it would
Yeah.
be you get caught at the border if you're trying to cross, and then
Okay.
you're placed into deportation proceedings. They're actually called removal proceedings, but that's not how most people think of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and you're just immediately placed into removal proceedings. The other would typically be um, you get charged with some kind of crime. So
Okay.
this is where criminal and immigration cases kind of mesh. It's very common for someone's in the U.S. either as a student or a visitor or on a work visa or a green card, anything where you're not a citizen, basically,
Mhm.
um, or if you're just undocumented.
Mhm.
If you get arrested, even for a minor crime, and you're fingerprinted, so let's say anything other than, say, a traffic ticket or a summons, something where you're just given a piece of paper by a law enforcement officer and you have to come to court, but you're never actually fingerprinted, it'll bring you to the attention of immigration.
Okay.
That's a very common way that someone will get put into removal proceedings.
You said if you're fingerprinted,
That's right.
but if you're not, it does not get the
You
attention.
can sometimes
Sometimes.
avoid being detected by immigration in that circumstance
Okay.
if you're just issued a summons
Okay.
and never fingerprinted.
It's when you were talking about affirmative actions, I'm thinking in the show 90 Day Fiance. You ever watch that show?
Yeah, I actually got an email once from one of the producers of that show asking if I had any clients that wanted to participate, and I said no, thank you. I don't think I do.
I've always been surprised. Sadly, I'm admitting I watched that show. I've watched many seasons of it, and I always am surprised when I see you have the attorney sitting with them giving legal advice with the cameras in. I'm like, guys, that's like a breach of attorney-client privilege. But
I imagine there's a lot of waivers that get signed when
yeah,
when you have somebody sign up for one of those. Hey, my wife is watching Love Is Blind right now, and I think I've maybe caught about half those episodes. So there's no shame in the 90 Day Fiance.
And so I'm going to transition a little bit to crimmigration, and we're talking about when the criminal world and the immigration world blend. But one question I had for you, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but you see a lot, especially locally here in Northern Virginia, you have situations where the local jails are refusing to cooperate with the immigration authorities. And a lot, especially from conservatives, but even people kind of closer to the aisle as me on the left side, they get confused by that and like, why aren't they doing their jobs? I don't understand how that works. Can you explain a little more detail as to what's going on there? Why
Yeah.
would the local authorities not want to work with immigration? Those kinds of things.
Yeah. So Part of this, I think, is just you'll hear this about sort of sanctuary cities as well. A lot of it depends on the local politics of the jurisdiction.
Mm.
So, um, especially in Northern Virginia, if you go back over the last, say, 10 or 15 years, you'll go all the way from a time period where jails were, if someone was arrested and taken to jail, the jail was really going out of its way. The sheriff was going out of its way to notify immigration
Mm.
and affirmatively choosing to hold immigrants to the furthest extent that they possibly could in the hopes of turning them over to immigration.
Mm.
And then as the politics have changed, the new sheriff gets elected. If they want the local policy to be that we're going to do everything we can to sort of not affirmatively try to hold immigrants and turn them
Mm.
over to immigration. So ICE has a way of still affecting that. They can issue a warrant for someone and they can detain someone, but it's something that they would have to take more precise action on. So that's been the big change.
Okay.
Mhm.
And just like everything is political, that's hypersensitive and all that. So I'm not going to get into what your thoughts are as far as
Yeah,
opinion wise, but
immigration has become this hot button political issue,
yeah,
which is I'm not the most political person,
yeah, totally
but
cool.
yeah, yeah.
Now let's. So I know that you're doing a lot of affirmative stuff, but and I'll tell people watching a lot of times where we intersect is I'll have a client charged with a crime,
Mhm.
and I'm trying not to screw it up. And there was a case probably 8 years ago now coming out of Kentucky where it puts an affirmative duty onto a criminal defense attorney to either know the immigration consequences or get the client advised. And I've chosen the latter. So I go to Brad to get opinions. So if you're a defense attorney and you don't want to learn immigration, I'd recommend you reach out to him. He gives good letters. But talk about if you have a client charged with a crime, you as an immigration attorney, what are you hoping that criminal defense attorney does in
Mhm.
preparation of making your job easier, making life easier for that
Yeah.
non-citizen?
So I think it's very important in almost all situations for the client to at least have a consultation with an immigration attorney.
Mhm.
I was a criminal attorney when that case you're describing came out.
Mhm.
Um,
What was that case called?
I think it was Padilla,
Padilla. There we go.
Kentucky. Yeah, yeah. And immigration's a pretty complex, vast area of law. I remember at the time feeling a bit overwhelmed, thinking
Mm.
I have to learn this entire new area of law as a criminal defense attorney. Um, I find there are many times where someone refers one of those cases to me. I talk to the immigrant. It sounds like there really aren't going to be any issues that they're going to face, and I'll just tell them that
Mm.
straight up. And I would hope that other immigration attorneys will do that.
Yeah.
So that'd be the first thing. Um, Never assume that your client is a citizen. It's very
Mm.
common for immigrant to have come to the U.S. when they're a child, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, and when you get them as a criminal defendant, as a criminal attorney, they have an American accent. There's nothing outwardly about their behavior or appearance that might make you think that they're
Mm.
a non-citizen. I would just never assume that. I think it'd be a good practice for criminal attorneys to just as in their intake, either on a form, when they're signing someone up for a consultation, or just at some point in their initial consultation, just to ask the client if they are a citizen.
Mm.
And if the client's a U.S. citizen, then there's nothing to worry about. If not, I think it's always a good idea for them to just at least have a consultation with an immigration attorney.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Talk about and I'll be honest, part of the reason I left the public defender's office is I remember that I think that case came out during that time, and we were essentially tasked to make these decisions, and somebody created some spreadsheet, and you don't know if it was current or not,
Mhm.
and you just kind of did the best you could. Um, Talk about some of the most common issues that you see, common charges that kind of go under the radar that you wish you could just go back and smack a defense attorney or a judge for letting it happen.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that's the most common, and this is still an issue in Virginia despite the change in law, would be some type of minor shoplifting or possession of marijuana offense.
Mm.
Just because most of the courts have many of the courts, at least in Northern Virginia, have a process where you can go to court without an attorney and you're sort of uh, herded into a system where there's a deferred disposition, meaning
Mm.
that you can enter a program where the charge is going to get dismissed, or talk to a criminal attorney and they direct you towards one of those programs where for state law purposes, you'd end up with a dismissal, but it would have really bad immigration consequences. And it depends on the status that the person has and the status that they may be applying for in the future. But historically, I find just because those charges are so common, that was the kind of thing that would often catch people up. And just to give you an idea of how nonsensical this can be, for lack of a better word, it's possible for someone who has a green card to get charged with possession of marijuana, not be deportable. So as long as they stay in the U.S., they're not going to have any problems, and they can apply for citizenship and become a citizen. But if they travel outside the U.S., when they're coming back into the country, they would get detained by immigration and would actually be mandatory. They wouldn't be able to get bond from deportation proceedings. So there's a lot of things that don't make a lot of sense about the way that the regulations are with immigration as far as criminal charges and convictions. But those are the most common charges. And then more serious charges, you would get to a point where if someone's charged with rape or murder, a lot of times as an immigration attorney, I'm going to tell that criminal defense attorney, just worry mostly about getting them the best result that you possibly can. The immigration consequences are going to kind of be secondary at that point. The cases that are most likely to be something where they're going to have pretty dire immigration consequences and wouldn't necessarily be something that an immigrant would think twice about when they were first charged would be shoplifting, minor drug possession, something like that.
What about like reckless driving?
Yeah, reckless driving, generally not a problem for immigration. Yeah. So generally speaking with immigration, something has to fall into a different, some type of category of crime that makes it a problem for immigration.
Well, and maybe let's talk about that a little more. What kind of categories of crimes you're looking at? And I am curious when it comes to reckless driving, like why does that not count? Because it is a class 1 misdemeanor in Virginia.
Yeah, so having a mens rea, and I'm not sure who this is directed at. If it's attorneys, they'll know what that means. But for a layperson, sort of
it's essentially the intent,
your
crime.
intent, your mental state when you're committing a crime.
Yeah.
If something's strict liability or reckless, there's a good chance it's not going to be a problem for immigration.
Okay.
Now that doesn't apply across the board because there's going to be some things like drug possession, something like that, where you could just be in actual possession of something, but maybe not have a mens rea associated with it. That's still going to be a problem for immigration.
Yeah.
But reckless driving is something where, because of the intent, because it doesn't have the requisite intent, and then because the effect of the crime, it's not a crime of violence, it's not a crime that involves child abuse, it doesn't fit into one of the other enumerated categories of crimes that could be a problem for immigration, it's generally not going to be a problem. Now, there's no easy answer for this because it does depend on what the person's immigration status is. So that's the first question I would always ask someone when they come to me for a consultation. Let's say someone is in the U.S. on a student visa or tourist visa, temporary work visa, something like that. Those are completely at the discretion of immigration. So it's something where immigration authorities can look much more deeply into what the crime was and then make a discretionary decision about whether they should allow you to remain in the U.S. So in that sort of circumstance, it would really depend on the facts of the reckless driving case. If someone's going 120 miles an hour on the highway and they're charged with reckless driving by speed, even though it's not something that would be categorically a problem for immigration in all circumstances, there might be a few types of status you could have that could jeopardize.
How about like a DUI? And part of the reason I'm asking is like the traffic stuff. It seems, well, DUI is serious, but like it's a more serious traffic offense. Like, what about a DUI? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So DUI is a tricky one. It's actually something where every time there's been a proposal in Congress by either party to have a large-scale immigration reform, which I think we've pretty much given up on at this point. But they've proposed making a DUI a more serious crime for immigration.
Yeah.
So I think part of this is it's something that our society's taken more and more seriously over time. And I do think it's possible that the immigration laws will reflect that at some point. As it stands right now, again, it depends on your status. So if you have a green card, DUI is generally not going to be a problem. However, I've had situations where someone's in the U.S. on an H-1B visa, or again, a student visa, any type of temporary visa. So anything other than having a permanent resident status, where they get a DUI before they're even convicted. Just a few weeks after they get the DUI, they get an email from the embassy in their home country saying, your visa's been revoked. And when your status expires, you need to come home, basically. So, I think it's something that immigration is sort of in a middle ground.
Okay.
DACA, if you have DACA status, or if you have some type of non-immigrant status, DUI can be a very serious problem. If you're a green card holder, it's generally going to be okay.
Okay. Now, I know when somebody like me messes up a criminal case, there's an option to try to reopen it. Talk about that process, how successful that is. Can the defense attorney help that process? What are those? What does that look like?
Sure. So there's two ways that immigration attorneys will try to do that. One is to basically say that the criminal attorney was ineffective, and that's a more formal way to go about it. It's an actual petition you make with the court, basically saying that, let's say a criminal attorney didn't advise their client of the immigration consequences, or refer them to an immigration attorney who could advise the client about the immigration consequences of the criminal charge, and then gives the client especially some affirmative advice that's not accurate. Then you can make a habeas petition and try to reopen the case. That can be successful, but it does ultimately end if you're successful with that, it results in the criminal case just being reopened. It doesn't necessarily mean that the case is going to resolve in a way that's more favorable. So if a client comes to me with something like that, a lot of times we're looking at it, and it helps to have, talk to the criminal attorney, or a criminal attorney who might be thinking of taking that case again, and first trying to decide, do we think that if the case was just recharged today, you started from scratch, are you going to get a better result? Could you actually get a result that's going to be favorable for immigration? That's not always the case.
Yeah.
The other way is to make an application with a court that, for lack of a better way to describe it, doesn't actually fit into some type of statute. I find this varies courthouse by courthouse. Many prosecutors will actually agree to try to just reopen a
motion to reopen.
Yeah, so just going in front of, especially in the general district courts in Virginia. Let's say someone pled guilty to shoplifting or possession of marijuana, something that, it's a pretty minor crime by state standards, but it's going to have a really outsized negative consequence on someone's immigration status. Many prosecutors are, if you talk to them, willing to try to help you to reopen that case and resolve it in a way where there may still be some punishment, but it's not going to ruin someone's life or really, really badly affect their immigration status. And I find in those situations, it's very courthouse by courthouse. So judge by judge. After it's been a certain number of days, so after 60 days from the date that case has been resolved, legally, the judge doesn't really have a grounds to open it, but many judges will still do that, I find, in general district court.
What reception are you getting from defense attorneys? Not specific ones, but generally, are most attorneys willing to say, you know what, I did screw that up, let me do what I got to do to help out? Or are they worried about malpractice, or how does that work?
Yeah, I think it's not one size fits all. So I find, for lack of a better way to describe it, the more honorable, maybe ethical criminal defense attorneys are happy to fall on their own sword. We're all human beings, and people make mistakes. And some attorneys are much more concerned about their own appearance or reputation in their business. For most people, it's a mixture of those things. But generally speaking, I find the criminal attorneys I would work with are happy to just tell the truth about what happened, and just let the chips fall where they may. And if they think maybe they made a mistake, they're happy to tell the truth about that. I remember, though, being in a CLE about this, and some criminal attorney basically raised his hand and was saying something like, "You mean to tell me I can't just lie about this?" Essentially something like that. I was thinking, like, we're in a CLE right now. You've got Just keep that to
Could you
yourself.
state your name for the
Raise
record,
your
please?
hand. So, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, and this is just a point that sometimes young attorneys or law school students be watching things like this, and
yeah.
the rule of the game is the worst case scenario: keep your mouth shut and ask for advice. I think affirmatively helping out is the best thing to do, but
Yeah,
don't make things worse by lying or trying to cover things up. That's how you get screwed. So,
absolutely.
yeah,
Generally speaking, yeah, if there's a young attorney watching this, if you go as when you've been practicing for a while, you start seeing who's running into ethical problems with the bar, and it generally is because someone's just not telling the truth.
yeah,
You're not going to get disbarred for making a mistake.
yeah.
People make mistakes. I remember I was actually a law clerk for a judge in Fairfax before I went to the public defender's office, and I was working on this sort of complex civil case, and these attorneys did this. I think it was a demur. I haven't done civil stuff in a long time, but it was they argued this motion, and the attorney that lost came up to me afterwards, and he said, "This is why they call it the practice of law. You're just gonna make mistakes. It's
Yeah, yeah,
practice."
yeah.
So it's not something that I think attorneys should be ashamed of. If they make a mistake, we're all human. It's
Yeah.
best to just tell the truth about it, and it can often help the client in
Yeah.
the long run if they're just honest about what happened.
Well, and the reality is when you try to cover things up, it just not only does it make things not good for the client, it makes it worse for you.
It
Um,
does.
this is more political, but I don't think necessarily political. It's more asking for observations. You've been. I remember. I think we graduated around the same time. What year did you graduate? I did 2008.
Yeah, it was 2009
Okay,
from law school.
so you came out. I came out. Obama's president.
Hmm.
Then Trump, and now Biden, and we're still having the same immigration debate. It seems like it just louder and meaner than it used to be. Over those 2.5 administrations, because we're still working through Biden's, like from an immigration standpoint, are you seeing any differences? Are you seeing, are what the politicians representing what they're feeding to the public? Just general,
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So,
yeah,
you notice a big difference with immigration. A lot
mhm,
of immigration is on the executive branch. So
mhm,
the courts, the appeals court for immigration, the initial appeals court, which is called the Board of Immigration Appeal, ICE. So the agency that's in charge of actually enforcing the immigration laws, it's all under the direct control of the executive branch. So
mhm,
whoever the president is, even without changing the laws, they can have a pretty outsized effect on
mhm,
the
mhm,
day-to-day experience of immigrants. So in the Obama era, they really focused on deporting immigrants who had been
mhm.
convicted of pretty serious crimes, uh, and they were very effective at that. I mean,
Yeah.
they did not um, hold back on enforcing the immigration laws against those immigrants,
Mhm,
and then they made an effort to have a sort of humane approach towards people who are in the U.S. undocumented, um, who had either been brought as children, so that's where DACA came about,
mhm.
or who just were generally, for lack of a better way to describe it, good citizens. I
Mhm.
know that sounds
Good
like an
folks, good
oxymoron. Yeah,
community
yeah,
members.
yeah, yeah. But people who were just, doing their work, paying their taxes, not getting into any trouble. Um, that administration was generally very lenient
Mhm,
with the enforcement of the immigration laws against that group of immigrants. And any administration is going to run into these problems where there's just not enough judges in immigration court. There's not enough resources. The cases demand a lot, and there's a huge backlog in immigration
mhm,
court. A lot of
mhm,
these immigration cases where people are getting in removal proceedings, they take 5 or 6 years to
mhm,
adjudicate.
mhm.
So I think they struck a nice balance during that administration. During the Trump era, it was the opposite. So they just decided they were going to try to deport everyone basically equally,
Yeah.
not make any kind of real determination. And the equivalent of this in criminal law would be if all of a sudden one day a prosecutor's office decided we're not going to offer any plea deals, not a
Yeah.
single plea deal for anybody. We don't care what you're charged with. Everybody's going to trial in
Yeah.
every single case. And you just imagine what that would do
Yeah.
to the court system.
Yeah.
You'd be setting trials years out.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what happened. So the other thing that happened during the Trump era was they put a hiring freeze on a lot of the immigration agencies. So even for something pretty mundane, applying for a work permit, or you're eligible for status through a family member, you want to bring your parents here, you're a U.S. citizen, you want to apply for your parents. The processing time on a case like that went from 6, 7, 8 months to 1.5, 2 years, something like that. So the Biden administration is publicly during the election and then afterwards stated that they were going to be more similar to the Obama era. I mean, that's what most immigration attorneys thought, is we just go back to what was going on during the Obama era. It hasn't been exactly like that. Somewhere in between, I'd say. But they can have a pretty large effect.
I'm seeing now and I don't know if just another Fox News that's blended over to CNN. I don't know what's going on, but I see another discussion about millions of people at the border, and you're seeing pictures of people under metal sheets and things like that. Like, what's going on now? And there's a Supreme Court issue coming up. Explain that to the best you can.
Yeah. So I think there's just a general, and I find for people who are not involved with immigration at all, just my parents or somebody who's not working in the field, there is a perception that people are sort of without cause just flooding the U.S.-Mexico border. I'd just start off by just saying many of those people are eligible for asylum. So, you're getting many people from El Salvador, Honduras, really pretty dangerous countries where the governments are in rough shape. There's a lot of crime, and not every single person, but many of those people are going to be eligible for asylum. And so a lot of them are coming through. And during the Trump era, they started a program called the Remain in Mexico program. So the idea was that, first of all, let's say you come to the U.S. border and you present yourself, you walk to the border. You walk up to an area where they're inspecting people, and you tell an agent, I'm from Honduras and I want to apply for asylum. I was targeted because I was the witness to a crime there, and the gang is going to kill me, something like that. Under international law that's been in place since World War II, we have an obligation to allow that person to apply for asylum. And for a long time, the process was basically admit the person, give them a court date. So they'd admit that person into the United States. Ask them, do they have any family or friends anywhere? Is there somewhere that it makes sense to send you, where you have resources, so you're not going to just be in a shelter somewhere? And then that person might end up in Virginia or Washington State, Denver, wherever they have some friends or family members. And then they would be placed into removal proceedings. During the Trump era, the solution they came up with for that was that we would still hear the asylum cases, but as the person was waiting for their case to be heard, they would stay in Mexico. This obviously presents a lot of problems for someone who is not Mexican, right? Like if you're Mexican, that's fine, I suppose. But
I mean, aren't they all Mexican? I thought that's what we learned from the Trump administration.
Right, that's another common misconception, I think. And so that program was heavily litigated.
Was there even any coordination with Mexico about
No, I do think initially Mexico was not too pleased with that prospect. I'm sure that during the Trump administration, a lot of the policies were designed to discourage people. I think the way a lot of politicians think about this is there's sort of like a supply and demand economics type approach to how to control this type of immigration. And I think that there's a perception on one side of the aisle that no one really has a valid asylum claim. People are just coming here to work. If we just make it more difficult for that to happen, if it's something where word gets around that if you're coming up and you present yourself at the border and you ask for asylum, you're going to just be in Mexico and you're not going to be admitted, then people just won't come at all. The word will travel down there, will discourage people from coming. I think what we've seen is that it's just not the case. People, and my experience has generally been with doing that type of work, like people are legitimately fearful
Yeah.
of returning to their home country. It's not something where a lot of them have a choice. I've represented many clients where, you know, I'm pretty certain that if we don't win their case, they're going to get murdered in their home
Yeah.
country. So that's I think the primary thing that we've seen is just that it just doesn't look to me like there's some way to, through that type of policy, just discourage people from coming in the first place.
I always thought it interesting. It's like the same people that talk about family values think that you wouldn't do anything for your family. And, if you've got a kid that you're worried about getting murdered by a local gang, I take what's the worst has happened? I get turned away. I mean, you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard for people to imagine who have been born and raised in the U.S. or any other kind of highly functioning country with a working government and police system. But if you're in a situation where the gangs are trying to recruit your 12-year-old kid, and if they don't join the gang, your whole family's going to get murdered or put in jeopardy, and the police can't do anything to help you. If you report it to the police, it's just going to make things worse. And you don't live in a large country where you can just go to Arizona and or wherever else, move 10 states away and not be in that same kind of danger. Your options get very, very limited. So that's the reality for a lot of the people who are showing up at the southern border, and a lot of them have successful asylum claims. I mean, I think it's wrong to think that people aren't succeeding with those claims. People are successfully getting asylum on that basis.
I have a lot of people that I talk to that aren't yet citizens, but they have, and I say to them, "Why don't you have the citizenship?" I just haven't gone through with the paperwork or whatever. Explain to anybody who may be watching this that isn't a citizen, but they're here legally and they have the avenue. Why is it so important for them to close that loop and get it done and get the citizenship if at all possible?
Yeah. So, the first thing is, and I always tell this to people, it's just never permanent, until you get your citizenship.
Yeah.
So the one way to look at having a green card or having permanent resident status, it's really just like having a permanent visa, just something that allows you to keep returning to the U.S. indefinitely. But if you get charged with a crime or have some other issue that jeopardizes that status, you could very quickly lose it. Then the other thing that happens to people, which I think they don't anticipate, is to maintain that status, you do have to be residing in the U.S. So once you become a citizen, let's say you get a job offer in Dubai that you want to take, you want to go there for 2 or 3 years, but you want to be able to come back to the U.S. afterwards. It's just some sort of temporary job. If you're a permanent resident, you're just going to lose your status. You can't leave the U.S. really for more than 6 months at a time, definitely not for more than a year at a time, without putting yourself at risk of just losing your permanent resident status. Once you become a citizen, all that's moot. At that point, there's just no way to lose that status. So I always suggest people do it. I think some people, it depends on the country. The U.S. allows you to have dual citizenship. So you can apply to become a citizen in the U.S., and the U.S. is not going to strip you of your other country's citizenship, but many, many countries don't allow you to do that. So let's say you are an Indian citizen, and you apply to naturalize and you become a naturalized U.S. citizen, you're going to lose your citizenship in India. And attendant to that, some of the rights that you have there, like the ability to own agricultural land, and so there's countervailing concerns for people depending on what country you're from. But if you think you're going to be in the U.S. permanently and this is where your life is, I can't stress enough how much I advise people to just become a citizen, because I've seen too many situations where someone's been here for 20, 30 years, something happens that they don't expect, and now they're going to have to go back to some country they haven't made their life in. They haven't been there for so long.
Am I correct? Recently, Virginia changed its rules to allow undocumented folks to get a driver's license.
Yes. And they don't call it a driver's license. They call it like a driver's privilege card, something like that. But they have.
Talk about the process to get that, if you know it, and what risks, because I think some people are just worried about announcing that they're here and giving
Mm-hmm.
information. Talk about
Yeah.
the complications that may arise from that.
So I do think that's something I would encourage people to do. So
Mhm.
you're better off having a driver's license than driving without one, because it is a crime in Virginia. And the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. That's the way I
Mm.
describe this to most
Mm.
immigrants. If something you disclose to the IRS is generally not going to make it back to the immigration authorities, or something you disclose to the Virginia DMV is generally not going to make it back to the immigration authorities. The exception to that is getting charged with a crime.
Yeah.
So the risk to you of driving without a license, I think, is just so much greater than applying for that provisional license or the driver's privilege card, that you should just go ahead and do it. And I can't remember off the top of my head the exact requirements for it. It's on the DMV website, but it basically requires that you be able to prove that you're residing in Virginia and basically paying your taxes here. And it's a little bit more complicated than it might be for someone who has lawful status to get a driver's license, but it's definitely something I would encourage anyone who doesn't have status to do.
And I don't know if you know the answer. I assume you can get car insurance and all that kind of stuff if you have yeah.
I believe that you can, yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know a lot of people, when they look at the politics of it, they're so offended by undocumented folks being able to drive with privileges, and I'm like, wouldn't you prefer that and then be properly insured, so if they cause an accident that you can get compensated, and they're more likely to be better drivers than just saying, let's just pretend they don't exist. They're not really here until they get arrested.
Right. I think the reality is that there's many undocumented people living in the United States, and like you're saying, do we want people to be driving insured and more safely under some of the regulations that we have in place, or do we want to kind of push them to the sidelines? And most places in the U.S. you can't get by without a car. I mean, if you want to get to work, if you want to go to the grocery store, you just need a car.
Yeah.
So the reality is people are going to drive.
Yeah. Well, at least until Elon makes us all autonomous vehicles.
It's like Jetsons. We could get sucked up into one of those tubes and spit out somewhere.
Well, Brian, look, this has been super useful. Is there any information that I haven't asked that you think people need to know and you wanted to hit on that we haven't yet discussed?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would just say for criminal attorneys, if you have someone who comes into your office for a consultation who's an immigrant, the one thing I do think it's important to advise someone, and I think this goes for every single case, is just tell them not to travel internationally until they talk to an immigration attorney. You think that would kind of go without saying for someone who gets charged with a crime, who's an immigrant, that they realize that might be a problem, but it's definitely not obvious to people, and it can just get you in some really hot water. It'll apply to every situation. There's no situation where that's bad advice. So if you have a consult with someone and they're an immigrant and they're charged with any kind of crime, just let them know they shouldn't travel internationally until they've talked to an immigration attorney.
Well, that's super useful. And again, for everybody watching, Brad is my go-to when it comes to immigration advice. Whenever I have somebody charged with a crime, even if I think it's probably not going to have an issue, I call Brad and I have the client, to the extent they can, retain him. So if you're a criminal defense attorney or you're thinking about doing criminal defense and you worry about the crimmigration issue, you can outsource that to guys like Brad, and because the law is constantly changing, it's too risky for the client to not do something like that.
And just so people know, generally the way that I handle that is I just have the attorney just refer the client to me. So the client will just contact me directly. Usually I get a little bit of information from the criminal attorney about exactly what the charge is. And a lot of times clients aren't totally clear on that. But you just refer the client directly to me, and then I take it from there.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to put your web address and contact information in the show notes here. So anybody watching, you can just go down below. So, Brad, again, thanks. Don't want to take up too much more of your time. Happy holidays, and look forward to working with you in the future. Okay, man?
You too, James. Thanks for having me on here.
Okay, let's do a little fancy outro.